Hello and welcome to Zilog and Moto. I'm your host Dave, who clearly has completely lost his mind in the run up to Christmas if you looked at the title card for today's video. Of course, there's those of you that probably would debate that if I ever had it, considering the content and mission of this channel. If you're a new visitor to Zilog and Moto and aren't aware of what that is, well, first, thank you for taking the time to watch, as I'm sure there's probably 1,000 other videos out there that probably would be more interesting than watching me attempt to review an encyclopedia. But the reason why I am performing this ridiculous task is because about 4 years ago, I decided that I didn't want to just collect Sega games. A lot of people do that, as I felt like I had something more to offer the community, and I thought that all these games that you see behind me, well, they deserve to be more than just alphabetized and to collect dust until the heat death of the universe. So I decided on two things: that I was going to more strictly define what this collection was going to be, which has ended up being every English language release for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X, and that I was going to review each and every one of these games, or encyclopedias as the case may be, no matter how good or bad, and then let you know the results with videos that showcase not just game footage recorded on original hardware, but also these physical packages, because we're not just talking about a bunch of ROMs here. That brings us to today's video. As I come up with the schedule of reviews, I try to balance out the 4 consoles, and every year do a certain amount of reviews of titles for each of those consoles, but then also try to mix things up so that I'm not doing too many reviews of games for one particular platform in a row. The last 3 reviews have been for the Genesis, and I hadn't reviewed a Sega CD title in a while, so I figured I should get one more of those on the schedule before the end of the year. Well, about 2 weeks ago, I found myself near Joliet, and I decided to check into the local disc replay. I've bought a few things from this particular store over the years, but nothing video game related in a while. However, as luck would have it, they had 2 things that I was interested in: a copy of Sports Pad Football for the Master System, and this, a very clean copy of Compton's Interactive Encyclopedia for the Sega CD. They also had a copy of Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective Volume 2 that I still do need, but the box was a bit torn up, so I passed on it. Anyway, I was happy to get that copy of Compton's Interactive Encyclopedia because it's in such good shape, but very quickly I realized that I had a problem on my hands. How the hell do I review a Sega CD release that's not a game? And granted, I've already had to deal with some problematic review scenarios so far on the channel, like reviewing very similar Genesis and Sega CD releases, like Bill Walsh College Football, Three Ninjas Kick Back, and Cliffhanger. And then there were the Jeopardy and Jeopardy Deluxe Edition, just disasters, that were the same game, but just with a different question database. But this isn't even a game. This is like exactly the opposite of a game. It's something that you would use in the school library or your home computer instead of playing a game on your Sega CD. Although, I suppose it could be worse. Someone could have found and finished the Sega CD version of Rise of the Robots, and I'd be stuck playing that instead. Ugh. Okay, enough stalling. Let's get into Compton's Interactive Encyclopedia, but first, a look at the package.
Okay, and this is my copy of Compton's Interactive Encyclopedia, fresh from disc replay, and as I mentioned previously, I'm really happy with it, or at least as happy as I can be with a Sega CD release that isn't actually a game. The oversized jewel case has a few scratches on it, but for the most part is pretty clean. More important than that though, the front and back of the case isn't cracked anywhere, and both of the hinges are fully intact, with both issues being something that plagues these type of cases. The tensile strength of this clear plastic just isn't that good apparently. And yes, I'm sure the fact that this is an encyclopedia and not an actual game probably helped it maintain its condition, as it probably has just collected a lot of dust in the last 30 or so years of it hanging around. The cover is actually pretty good. This is some sharp-looking artwork that was clearly designed by someone who knew what they were doing, and it's in line with the art that was used on similar vintage editions, i.e. the 1995 version, for the PC. However, I should mention that this is far from the only version of Compton's that's out there for the Sega CD, even though it was only released in the United States. Which kind of makes sense when you think about it. Why release a English encyclopedia in Japan, and while English would somewhat work for Europe, they probably would want a selection of articles that was more skewed towards that continent. The other version of Compton's that were released were all based around JVC's XI. If you're unfamiliar with the oddly named XI, it was a Sega CD and Genesis all built into one console that was originally released in Japan with a slightly more whimsical name, the Wonder Mega. The XI had 3 pack-in discs, a CD&G karaoke disc, a copy of Prize Fighter, and Compton's. But that version of Compton's had a cover that more resembled the original 1993 release of that title, and it definitely sucks in comparison to the updated cover. The XI would get 2 updated versions of Compton's during the life of the console, but the cover was never updated to match the standalone version. One other thing that the design of the cover that I have to point out, take a look down at the lower right-hand corner. Yes, your eyes are not deceiving you, that is a GA rating from Sega's VRC. At first I was pretty shocked that Sega decided to give what's clearly not a game a content rating, but then I thought about it for a minute, and it made sense because even though encyclopedias are designed as informational tools, there's some subject information that they might be providing that would not necessarily be suitable for all ages, so that GA should serve as a note to parents that they wouldn't have to worry about their kids looking up anything potentially disturbing for a young mind. Flipping over the back, and just like the front, the rear design is very nice and clean, and thinking about it, this makes sense considering that the release is from a company that makes encyclopedias, and is well versed on page layout design principles. I like the 2 screenshots they used, because it appears that they're honest about how the product looks, rather than some of the Sega CD screenshots that we've seen, where it's clear that they weren't an accurate portrayal in an effort to get kids to want to buy the game. Opening up the case, and the inner materials are in mint condition, with even still having the foam disc protector. The manual is, as expected, very simplistic, only consisting of 3 pages of instructions, but it does serve the purpose of explaining how to use the software, and even has a few screenshots to illustrate things. Okay, that's the package for Compton's Interactive Encyclopedia. Let's get our learning on, and see how they handled the transition from PCs and Macs. So you may be less than surprised to learn that I can be a bit of a nerd. Yeah, no, quell surprise. But I think I come by it honestly, as I've always been interested in facts. Growing up, my house had a copy of the World Book Encyclopedia from somewhere in the late 60s to early 70s that my grandparents had bought for my mom to use when she was in school. And sure, certain things were well out of date when I would look at it back in the late 80s and early 90s, but there was still some good evergreen information in there. Things like, what the hell is up with Greenland? And information about the Civil War. But one thing I always remember is that the World Book is what taught me how to count in Roman numerals. The article that covered Roman numerals had this odd picture of Romans from a puppet show that always caught my eye, and I remember sitting down with the article as a kid and trying to figure out the really long letter combinations. And there would occasionally be other things like that, where like a random picture or heading caught my eye as I was flipping through, and I'd pick up on something that I didn't know. As cool as it was to grab a random letter volume off the shelf and just look at it, a traditional physical encyclopedia does have some pretty obvious limitations. One of those is one I just referenced, with the books being stuck in time, and every year that passes since their publication, the information within becomes more and more out of date and possibly inaccurate with all the changes to the world on a daily basis. This leads to the next problem, which is that a set of physical encyclopedias is usually fairly large and expensive, so replacing them with a newer set to get updated information is no small task. But what if you could replace all the information that you previously had in a set of 26 or so books with a disc that fit in the palm of your hand? And not only that, easily have full color images, sounds, and even videos to better explain all the subjects. And due to the fact that all the data was stored on an easily reproducible disk, the cost of the encyclopedia was dramatically lowered due to not having to destroy a forest every time one was printed. Sounds like a great idea, right? And it was. I'm pretty sure every kid who went to school in the 90s ended up using some form of digital encyclopedia as a source for research when writing papers, working on projects, or simply having to waste time in the library when bored during a study hall. This brings us to Compton's Interactive Encyclopedia. Compton's Encyclopedia was a competitor of the World Book Encyclopedia that my mom had, and its physical version dates back to 1922. For about 40 years, Compton's operated on its own, and then it was purchased by Encyclopedia Britannica in 1961. Why Britannica wanted to have a second encyclopedia to compete with itself, I'm not sure, but I think the goal was to have Compton's serve the less expensive market and compete with World Book, while Britannica served the more premium market. Yeah, there was a reason why we had World Book and not a Britannica. Anyway, toward the end of Britannica's first ownership of Compton's, they came up with the idea of the first multimedia encyclopedia, and named it just that, releasing Compton's Multimedia Encyclopedia for home computers in 1989. In 1992, Compton's New Media, the newly renamed software arm of Encyclopedia Britannica, released an update to Compton's Multimedia Encyclopedia, this time naming it Compton's Interactive Encyclopedia, a name that would stick on versions of the software from 1993 to 2001. With the advent of multimedia-based home gaming consoles, Compton's decided to branch out and release console versions of Compton's Interactive Encyclopedia as well, and versions of the software were released for the Philips CDI and Sega CD in 1994. Personally, I think this was a great idea at the time for the simple reason that in the early 90s, many households still didn't have home computers. Remember, in the pre-internet era, while DOS-based PCs and Macintoshes with multimedia setups were beginning to become more commonplace, they still certainly were not cheap, and many households that did have computers had aging machines from the pre-multimedia era that weren't equipped to handle much more than simple word processing or maybe floppy-based DOS games. With that in mind, both versions made sense, but for slightly different reasons. The Philips CDI was known for having an edutainment slant to its library, and the Sega CD gave Compton's the most exposure of any CD-based console in 1994. As far as the Sega CD version goes, I browsed around in it for about an hour and a half for the purposes of this review, and honestly, considering the limitations of the Sega CD, I think it comes off pretty well. Granted, a home computer version of the encyclopedia will ultimately be more useful for doing research, due to being able to take quotes directly from the software and not having to transcribe things. I found articles included in the Sega CD version to be informative and certainly worthy of being an official source. Also, there seemed to be a nice variety of articles, including not just articles on major subjects like countries and government figures, but also some fairly obscure mentions of local Chicago suburbs, for instance. I definitely was not expecting to see blurbs on Downers Grove and LaGrange, Illinois, that's for certain. However, I don't think it's inaccurate to say that Compton's heavily skewed the included articles to focus on the subjects of history, geography, and science and nature. Not saying that there's anything specifically wrong with that, but if you're wanting to use the encyclopedia to get historical facts about various sports or entertainment figures, you're probably going to come up empty. I'm not sure if this was purely an editorial choice or simply having to decide what articles and media they had space for, or if they simply had concerns about running into potential trademark and rights issues. But either way, you're going to want to consider more traditional sources if you're looking in one of those areas. Also, just as a footnote to that last statement, Compton's takes up less than 400 megabytes on disk, so the storage medium was definitely not a limitation in what they chose to include in the software. One thing I was impressed with by Compton's was its ease of use. Granted, it is just an encyclopedia, so it's not like users would expect to need to hit some sort of 3-button combination to search for an article, but still, I found the interface to be very streamlined and intuitive. The manual is completely not needed, as anyone should be able to figure out how to navigate the menus in the first minute or so of use. When you first boot up the software, you're greeted with a menu that allows you to pick from 4 indexes, with either the library of text articles, pictures, sounds, and videos being selectable. Once you make your choice of which library to peruse, you can then either scroll through the libraries via up and down arrows, or type in a search term at the bottom using the pointer to skip to that section of the alphabet. Also, depending on the text article that you're reading, some of them have embedded links in them for various types of media to add context to those articles, and considering that this was 1994, having these web page styled hyperlinks, for lack of a better term, in the articles was pretty slick. For an interface that was designed for use with a controller and one button, I don't think they could have done a better job. It would have been nice had Compton supported the Sega Mega Mouse as well, but the software worked perfectly fine without it. I think the only technical issue I ran into was when you go to play one of the sound files, you have to let the sound file finish playing before you can navigate away to go look at something else, which seems practically antique these days, and it is. But when you remember that the file is being actively streamed from a 1x CD-ROM drive, then it makes sense that it can only do so much at one time. Honestly, the amount of loading and lag time encountered when using the software is very minimal. This is due to the majority of the articles and files being very small, so not much is needed to read from the disk at one time. But still, it's nice that this isn't an issue and gives Compton's a more refined feel. Having said that, the multimedia files included with the software can definitely be a bit on the compressed side. Pictures tend to hold up pretty well in color or in black and white, but occasionally you'll run into one where it's difficult to make out what's on the screen. The sounds and videos, unfortunately, are more of a mixed bag. Almost any music or speech clip included sounds tinny, and the same goes for the sound that accompanies the videos. The videos themselves range from poor quality slideshows to decently encoded clips, and every time I tried a new one, it seemed like a gamble if it would be a good clip or not. Going back to the amount of free space that was left on the disc, even with the Sega CD's known technical limitations, I feel like they could have done a better job on the multimedia front. It's not horrible, and I enjoyed clicking on various clips at random to see what would pop up, but it definitely seems like a first effort that perhaps would have been improved if a second edition had ever been released. Clearly, in looking at Compton's Interactive Encyclopedia, I can't really compare it to anything else I review here on Zilog and Moto because it's not a game, and I don't think you could even call it an edutainment title because I feel like that has to involve some sort of activity or game. No, it solidly is a piece of reference material, just having an, at the time, modern package. I'm still going to rate it though because it is a piece of software. Having said that, I'm giving Compton's Interactive Encyclopedia for the Sega CD 3 stars. Of course, by 2022 standards, it's a mere curiosity in a library of games, with articles that date back to when the Honorable Richard M. Daley was still in his first term as mayor of Chicago. But for its time, it was an impressive piece of software for the Sega CD that otherwise would require a much more expensive personal computer to utilize.
And that was Compton's Interactive Encyclopedia for the Sega CD. When I first saw this on the shelf at Disc Replay, there was no question that I had to have it to fill out my library of titles for the Sega CD. But I'll admit, I had no idea if I was going to review it, or even if I could do a video about it that made sense. But now, after having put this review together, I'm actually pretty proud of it, even if I'm sure that no one is going to watch it. Seriously, I'm willing to bet that Pro Quarterback is going to end up having more views than this, and that game is terrible. Next week on Zilog and Moto, it's back to the Genesis, with 2 reviews to finish out the year. The first of which is for a game that I've been curious about ever since I picked it up off of eBay a few years ago. For some reason, I had mistakenly thought that it was based on an arcade game that I've just never played, but as it turns out, that is not the case, and it's actually an American Genesis exclusive, so it's never appeared on any other console, and it was only released in the United States. This should be pretty interesting, to be sure. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 180. If you liked what you saw here and would like to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other.